with that, I'd like to introduce our guest, Arif Hussein, who's the chief economist of the World Food Program, and Rain Paulson, who's been a frequent guest here from the FAO, who's the director of emergencies. Are you gentlemen on?
Yes, we are.
We see you. Great. So I think Arif will let you go first, and then we'll move on.
Thank you, Stefan. Hello, everybody. So I'm just going to very quickly present the results of what is called the Global Report on Food Crises. It is a report which is essentially produced by about 17 different partners, from the UN, from development agencies, from humanitarian agencies, from regional bodies, and they look at the situation, the hunger situation of the world, but from the acute food insecurity side. This report is done by what is called the Food Security Information Network for the big body, which is the Global Network Against Food Crises. One thing to note about this report is that this doesn't cover the entire world, but it focuses on 53 countries in 2021, and then it also provides a forecast for about 41 countries going forward. So this is not the whole picture, but it is a subset of a picture on which there is big consensus. In terms of the numbers in 2021, in these 53 countries, there were more than 193 million people who were in crisis or worse level of food insecurity. Over 500,000 people in 4 countries were in catastrophe or famine. About 39 million people were in emergency in 36 countries, meaning a step away from famine. And then an additional 133 million people in 36 countries were in crisis level of food insecurity. Now, this obviously, from year to year, the numbers of countries which we cover kind of go up. But we have been doing this for the last 6 years. So when we look at the trend, what we find is that hunger since 2016 has been consistently going up, acute hunger, crisis level hunger, meaning that in 2016, we had about 94 million people who were in crisis or worse hunger conditions. In 2021, that number was 180 million people. That is a 92% increase in just 6 years. Now, other thing which is important to note is that these 570,000 people who are in famine were in 4 countries in 2021, meaning Ethiopia, in South Sudan, in Yemen, and in Madagascar. Of these 4 countries, 3 were purely conflict, meaning Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Yemen. And Madagascar famine in 2021 was related to climatic shocks. But by the way, we've never had 570,000 people in catastrophe in any of the 6 years that this report has been produced. Another interesting fact is that in 6 countries, there are at least 12 million people who are in crisis or worse food security situation. This is like the top one: Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Yemen, Northeast Nigeria, and Syria. Now, coming very quickly to what are the root causes? What is the reason why? And the biggest by far reason is man-made conflict. Of these 193 million people in countries, 72%, meaning are in this situation because of conflict. Another 30 million people in 21 countries are suffering because of economic shocks, mostly driven by COVID and its consequences as well. And then another 23.5 million people in 8 countries are suffering because of climatic shock. So these 3 reasons if I can say it again, conflict, climate, and COVID-related economic consequences are some of the biggest reasons why we are seeing such levels of food insecurity and hunger in the world. A couple other things. Uh, there are about 51 million internally displaced people globally, okay, of which 45 million, almost all, are in 24 countries which are affected by food crises. So there is a really strong correlation between conflict, displacement, and food insecurity. And the top six over there, again, Syria, Afghanistan, DRC, Yemen, Ethiopia, and Sudan. Then we also looked at the children. And what we find is that in these 53 countries, there are about 26 million children who are severely wasted, who are wasted and severely wasted. By the way, 11 million of those, 11.5 million of those are only in 4 countries. So, and those countries again are Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Sudan, and Yemen. So you can see the trend that a lot of food insecurity, a lot of conflict, a lot of displacement, a lot of child malnutrition, it is concentrated in few countries, but with very, very big numbers. Now, I mentioned that, this report also looks at the forecast, meaning for year 2022. And that's really scary because just in 41 countries around the world, 181 million people are forecasted to be in crisis or worse situations in 2022. And by the way, this doesn't account for Ukraine or what its consequences beyond the borders of Ukraine. Now, very quickly, as World Food Program, as you may know, we are present in about 80 plus countries. So we keep an eye on all those 81 countries. And our figures, even before Ukraine, for those 81 countries, were already 276 million people. This had risen from about 150 million post pre-COVID. And we have also analyzed, what would be the impact of Ukraine crisis on global food insecurity. And what we see is that we expect another 47 million people to become acutely food insecure, meaning in crisis or worse situation. So altogether, that puts us to about 323 million people around the world. Now, what we are saying is that as World Food Program, that we need to assist these people. Now we are planning to reach as many as 145 million people this year. For that, we continue to need financing, but also in many parts, sustained humanitarian access. I will stop here. Thank you.
Now we turn the floor over to Mr. Paulson.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity. And as you've heard, Arif has laid out all of the numbers in this 6th edition of the global report. So let me maybe just build on that by focusing on a small number of concerns. The first of which relates to the increase in acute food security as we've documented it, and this steady progression that Arif was mentioning since 2016. One other key indicator to complement what Arif just shared, if over those 6 years you look at the percentage of the population analyzed who are in acute food insecurity, that has also gone up from just over 11% in 2016 to just over 22% in 2021. So, I mean, there's a lot of numbers here, but the message that comes quite clearly through all of this is food security, acute food insecurity has been getting progressively worse over those years. Obviously, that's the first of our concerns. But our second concern related to this as well then relates to funding flows and financing. Arif was mentioning what the World Food Program requires. I'll say something about FAO in a second. In a macro sense, At the same time as you have these 6 years of worsening acute food insecurity, what we see in 2020, the last year we've done this analysis, is a 5-year low in funding for food crisis context. And here I'm talking specifically then about funding for food security activities, funding for the types of activities that the WFP does, FAO does, importantly also funding for nutrition work that entities are going into. So in 2021, there was $8.1 billion collectively available for emergency work in these settings. That's 25% lower than in 2017. Obviously then, these trends of increases in acute food insecurity as documented through the global report and the numbers you've just heard, matched with a declining global trend in funding is of huge concern. And the third piece I want to mention on this, and Arif touched on it, but it is really important to underscore, this analysis and even these early projections for next year, when already we're seeing that in 41 of the countries for which we have data as we're looking into 2021, there are already an additional 5 million people in acute food insecurity beyond the current projections. As we look at all of these numbers, that analysis is not yet factoring in the consequences of the war in Ukraine on global food security. So we're facing a significant challenge. Our concern and our priority as FAO is, quite frankly, that we need to redouble investment in famine prevention. We need to redouble investment in agriculture as part of famine prevention. You've heard the headline numbers. Just to say that 2/3 of all of these individuals who are experiencing acute food insecurity are located in rural areas. These are individuals who live and rely on agriculture for their survival. One other quick statistic, at the risk of putting too many out there, but funding for agriculture in particular, when we did our analysis over the last 5 years, was just 5% of what went into overall food security. So this is something that does need to be addressed as part of the overall response. The FAO is urgently asking for $1.5 billion now, right now, to support 50 million of the world's most food insecure people. We're on the ground, we're delivering in Ukraine, in elsewhere, and that's our priority and our commitment. Maybe the last comment I'd make, and then happy to see what questions may come in. As we held the release event today for the global report, there were a lot of, I think, really important reflections that come through also in the analysis on the need for working across humanitarian development and peace pillars. If we're seeing this worsening trend year on year and the decline in funding, it's also telling us that we have to work differently. We know how to do it, but we do need support and attention to drive forward programming in the Nexus space if we're going to address root causes. And that's really probably the biggest rallying cry that comes out of this analysis. But let me maybe stop there and revert back to the chair for any questions that colleagues may have.
Over for questions. First question goes to Edie Lederer.
Thank you very much on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association for doing this briefing. I have two questions. First, you said that the impact of the ongoing war in Ukraine has not yet been factored in. Can you give us any indication of the impact you believe it will happen, particularly on countries that are already facing severe insecurity in food? Secondly, in terms of the financing issue, obviously COVID was one issue in recent years, but in that decline from 2017 to 2020, 2021. What other issues do you see that were key to the loss of significant financing, and how are you going to recoup that money and reach the very significant funding that you need for this year? Thank you.
Okay, Paul, would you like, I can go first if you want, right?
Go ahead, please, Arif. Yeah.
So just on the increased number because of the Ukraine crisis, as World Food Program, we did the analysis, and we tried to essentially look at how many more people would be affected because of the war in Ukraine in terms of higher food prices, higher fuel prices, and also inflation transmitting from global level to different countries. And our estimate or our projection is that it would be an additional 47 million people who would be acutely food insecure because of this crisis now. There are also many other numbers which are out there, which are also essentially in the same let's say range. The other thing I wanted to say was that it is not only that the numbers are increasing, but it is also impacting us as World Food Program because our costs are going up. Our costs of assisting people are going up. To put that in perspective, our costs from 2019, meaning before COVID, to today have gone up by $71 million more per month. This $71 million is enough to feed, both with food and cash, about 3.8 million people every month, per month. So it is a significant impact on people, but also on the ability of humanitarian agencies and other agencies in order to help. On your second question, I would just say that, this war is not happening in a vacuum. We were already dealing with the consequences of COVID in terms of people's reduced incomes. Even food and fuel prices before Ukraine war were already at a 10-year high for food and 7-year high for fuel. So what you're seeing this crisis is essentially more fuel on a fire which was already burning and burning hot.
If I could maybe add to what Arif has shared, when you look at the report, and I hope you do get a chance to look at the details, you'll see, amongst other things, that there's a core set of 19 countries that have been consistently at the heart of this analysis over the 6 years. There's a larger group of countries, as Arif mentioned, but they constitute between 70 to 80% of the total acutely food insecure population that's analyzed. The fact that those countries are there year on year, so our analysis spreads back 6 years, these crises go back even before then in most cases. If you ask the question around, well, what's been happening in terms of funding trends, I do think it's important for us to take away the fact that in these protracted crises, we have to find a way to work differently in the nexus, right? And I think also donors expect that, and that may be one of the reasons why there have been some challenges, but it's a very complex question around why the funding has gone down. But, for us, what we're advocating strongly for as FAO is, the right type of mix of programming. We need to go big when it comes to emergency food aid interventions to tie acute families over in a lean season. We need to go big when it comes to ensuring that farming families have the seeds and the inputs they need to plant in a cropping season. We need a much more nuanced approach. We have the skill sets, capacities, analysis. We do this in many contexts, but we're reliant on not just amounts of money, but money being given at the right points in time for particular crisis context. And so that's another key message I'd share in response to your question. Thank you.
James?
James Bays from Al Jazeera. Your report focuses on the very worrying situation, as you say, in some of these countries, 40 or so countries, and very severe situation in about 5 countries. What is your message, though, today to the biggest, richest countries? What do you say today to the G7, the G20? How urgent is this for them to do more?
I think this is an excellent question. I think this is food insecurity around the world is exploding. Hunger is exploding. And if we don't address these issues, we end up paying, frankly, thousands times more just a few years down the road. We have seen this happen after Syria crisis in Europe. We have seen this happen with Afghanistan. We have seen this happen with Central America in the US. We have seen this happen with Haiti in the US. So we need to have 2 types of solutions. One is absolutely now, making sure that people don't starve. And then we need to think a little bit longer term, where it is about rethinking our agricultural policies. It is about rethinking our energy policies so that we are not in a space like this ever again. I will also go and say that it is not about being self-sufficient in food, but it is certainly about being diversified in your food and in your energy. And I think this is one of the big lessons learned of this crisis. We need to make sure, I mean, if you saw your own, let's say, investment portfolio, you would not buy one single asset, or you would not buy, one single stock in a particular asset. You will diversify. Why is our food not diversified enough? Why is our stocks not diversified enough and held by only a few countries? So when there is a shock, you feel that across the world. I think these are the big lessons which we need to address going forward, so we are not in the same position again. And this, frankly, is not new. We were here in 2008 after the food and fuel crisis. Some things then would have happened, but they didn't happen. We were again there in 2011. Nothing happened. Maybe this is the 3rd time, and hopefully we do something about it. But that would be the medium term. We need to deal with immediate short term, saving people's lives, and also then rethink our policies, like I said. Thank you.
Thanks. Edward?
Some-
Oh, sorry, Mr. Paulson.
Sorry, just one quick statement. If the question is what's the message to the G7 and others, I would simply say that the example of what was possible in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, I think, is compelling. We need to put the same energy collectively that we put into addressing the COVID-19 pandemic into addressing acute hunger. That's simply stated. The amounts of resources that were mobilized and the way in which new mechanisms, new structures, new solutions were put in place tells us that we can do this. It's about political will and focus. So let's use that example to address acute hunger. Thank you.
Edward?
Hi, this is Edward from China Central Television. This question is for both Mr. Hussein and Mr. Paulson. First, do you have any data of how much of the normal agricultural activities has been interrupted in the Ukraine because of the conflict, and what that could mean? And secondly, how would the Ukraine conflict affect the export of the Russian agricultural products, and what would be the effect for the world food supply? Thank you.
Let me just take it one by one. As you know, Russia and Ukraine, they are in top 5 exporters of wheat, of corn, and of sunflower oil seeds, basically. So that's the first part. The second part is that there is not much grain or commodities coming out of Ukraine. There are commodities coming out of Russia, but they are coming out at a much higher cost, meaning freight cost. So this is why when you look at this problem from a consumer side, it costs a lot more now because of this crisis than it cost before this crisis. So now put yourself in a position where in a low-income country or lower middle-income country where you were, let's say, spending 50% of your income or more on food, and suddenly your food got more expensive. This is what we are seeing in many parts of the world as we speak. One other thing which is really important, we talk about food, high food prices affects people. We talk about high fuel prices, which affects everybody. But don't forget high fertilizer prices. And why is fertilizer so important? Because it has consequences for the next agricultural season. Right now, it's not a production problem, it is an access, affordability problem. But if there is not enough fertilizer, if there is not enough other agricultural inputs, come next season, it would be availability and affordability problem.
Maybe just in the interest of time, let me say, if you go to the FAO website, there's a dedicated page on the war in Ukraine and implications, and there's updated analysis there on the food security situation in the country, as well as analysis on global implications too. So I just refer you to that analysis, please.
Thank you very much. Arul?
Arul Lewis from IANS. You said that the Ukrainian crisis has exacerbated the food crisis or the global food security situation overall. India has a huge surplus of wheat amounting to tens of millions of tons. Are any of your organizations doing anything to utilize more of the stockpile? And a second question related to that is the World Trade Organization has put restrictions on how much India can export. Would you think that those rules should be suspended in the current emergency? Thanks.
Okay, so all I can tell you is that we are in discussions with India on procurement of wheat. So that is something which is ongoing, and also that one of the recommendations, whether it is World Food Program or IMF or World Bank or even also World Trade Organization, is about exemption of World Food Program from export bans. And this is something, there was a press release on this only a couple of weeks ago, where these organizations, they're encouraging governments not to put export bans, not to put things like that, which then artificially increase the price and availability or reduce the availability of major staple commodities. So this is something which is a very big recommendation, and hopefully countries are listening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I don't have anything
all right.
particular to add on that.
Sorry, were you making a response?
No, sorry, to say I don't have anything in particular to add on this,
Okay.
but the analysis around availability of commodities in different countries is, and I've factored into the analysis I referred to on the FAO website, but it's an area that sits a little bit outside of my direct area of responsibility. Thank you.
Thanks. Last question, Ibtisam?
Thank you, Farhan. Thank you for the briefing. My name is Ibtisam Azim from Al Arabi Al Jadid newspaper. I have two follow-ups. The first one about you said that the commodities that coming out of Russia are higher now. So my question is, what's the reason behind that? Is it does it have to do with the fact that the Russians raised the prices, or the sanctions, or both, or what exactly behind that? And then the second question about the issue of free thinking, the agriculture map. So my question is, how long would it take from the process of rethinking to actually seeing and starting to make some change in this regard? Thank you.
Let me just correct that. No, I didn't. What I said was that there are commodities which are coming out of Russia, but the freight costs are higher than they used to be. But from Ukraine side, there's not much coming out at all. That's what I was saying. I'm sorry, I didn't get your second question.
Yeah, no, sure. So you talked about the fact that we need to rethink the way the commodities and the agriculture goods are contributed, and where are they, and how. And the question is, and you talked about the fact that there was problems in 2008, and then about 2 years later, and nothing has changed, or not much. And maybe now, for the third time, there will be some changes. The question is, from that process until you start having changes, and who needs to make the change? Governments, or etc.?
Yeah, I think that's India, exactly. That's what I said. And basically, what I was saying is that yes, it is the governments. We need to make sure that our food supplies are sufficiently diversified. So when there is some kind of bottleneck or some time of a crisis, the consequences of that are not as devastating as we see right now. That's what I was saying. Thank you.
Yeah, no, but my question is, how long are you? It's going to take from this thinking until basically starting to see changes.
I can't hear you. There was too much disruption.
She asked, how long will it take before we can start to see changes?
Well, that's again a very good question. I think this is not, when you're dealing with agricultural issues, it's not something which you can do in a month or a week, or it takes some time. But that's why it is important to do what needs to happen in the near term, which is saving people's life, but also then in the medium term, help, implement some of these things where then your energy supplies and your food supplies are diversified. So it takes time. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but that doesn't mean that we should not do it. Over.
I think there's a really important point here, which is that we have the models. We know how to address these things, right? We know how to build social protection systems at scale. We know how to put early warning systems in place. We know how to strengthen resilience at community level. But the amount of resources that go into that at the moment is minuscule compared to what's required. And so I think it's less about the models and much more around ensuring that those models are resourced in the right way to create the transformative change that's required. That's another sort of rallying cry that comes out, I think, of the global report released today and some of the reflections around it.
Excellent.
Okay. I don't see any further questions, so I would like to thank once again our guests, Arif Hussain and Rain Paulson. Thanks very much for your presentations, and have a good afternoon and good evening to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Likewise. Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks.